consciousness is the starting point of reality.
Completely antithetical to that attitude in science.
What is reality?
We're now at this great inflection.
Video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today.
The whole point of a virtual reality is to have useful fiction of causality.
The individual never gets enlightened. It's the enlightenment that becomes the individual.
Space-time is doomed.
Consciousness is fundamental.
Einstein's theory actually predicts its own demise.
Balance is not the ability to stand up, it's the ability to rise up.
Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Right. I should say why the scientists stick with the idea that consciousness is a product of physical stuff. And by the way, you know, the researchers who are doing this are brilliant. Many of them are personal friends of mine, and hats off to them. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. They're brilliant people. They're wonderful people, and they're well motivated. They're trying to understand consciousness as a product of brain activity, say, or physical systems more generally. And here's the kind of evidence that they would use to say why they think that they're right. If I take a magnet called a transcranial magnetic stimulator, TMS unit, and I touch it to an area up here of just outside your skull, just touch your skull with it, close to what's called area V5, visual area 5 of the cortex in the left hemisphere, you will all of a sudden not be able to see anything moving in the right part of your visual world. You can see motion of objects in the left part of the visual world, but not in the right. You get what's called hemiakinetopsia. You turn the magnet off, and all of a sudden you once again have the conscious experience of things moving smoothly in space. But when I put the magnet on there, it's more like a stroboscope, like at a disco, where you see something there, then you see it there, but you don't see it moving smoothly. And so it's a natural conclusion from something like that says, look, I intervene on the brain, and when I change the state of the brain, your conscious experience changes. And when I stop intervening, the conscious experience changes back.
Yeah.
And it's very natural for people to say that's clear empirical evidence that the brain causes consciousness.
But yes,
so
but in a way,
so
like from a spiritual perspective, this is within the existing explanations, because one separates what we call vertical and horizontal consciousness. The horizontal consciousness is when consciousness is being projected through a form. So basically that form functions both as a filter, but then also becomes an entity of consciousness. And the vertical consciousness is kind of beyond the form. So this is the whole idea around incarnation, that consciousness incarnates and then gets kind of locked into that form, and then is able to experience through that form based on its limitations. Because, in spiritual traditions, one would see all manifestation and incarnation as a result of resistance. So everything in existence is there to protect one from the absolute reality, which one is not able to deal with. So one is able to experience limited versions of reality until the consciousness expands to the level of being able to embrace all there is. So in that process, one separates the idea of the vertical consciousness from the horizontal one.
I like that idea, and let me try to say it in another language and see if you agree, if it's on the same track as what you're saying. So another way perhaps to say that idea, if I understand you, is that space and time, I like to call them, space and time and physical objects are just like a virtual reality. They're not the final reality, they're a visualization tool. And so if consciousness is fundamental and consciousness is complex, I might have a visualization tool that dumbs things down a little bit, that makes it more accessible to me. And so I'm I am interacting with other consciousnesses. I think that's what you called the vertical consciousness, but I only see it through an interface, through a visualization tool, which would be what I think you were talking about as the horizontal side of things. And if you then think about how we actually use these, like a virtual reality visualization tool, like if we're playing a game, like, an auto racing game of some kind, right? And you see a virtual steering wheel and you see virtual cars. And you know that if you turn the steering wheel, the car will seem to go to the left if you turn counterclockwise, and right if you turn clockwise, and so forth. It feels to you like the steering wheel has causal powers. I turn to the left, it has that intervention in the virtual realm feels like it's actually doing something real because my car seems to be moving in a different way. Similarly, then the brain would be like that steering wheel. It's not the fundamental reality, it's a virtual reality. And so the whole point of a virtual reality is to have a useful fiction of causality. It's not genuine causality, it's a useful fiction of causality. I mean, in the virtual reality game, in that metaphor, what you're really interacting with is some supercomputer with all of its diodes and resistors, voltages and magnetic fields. But you don't see that. You're just turning a steering wheel. But by turning the steering wheel, you think the steering wheel is doing all the work. But in fact, that's really what was really going on is millions of voltage changes are happening in the computer. And that's what's really doing the work. And so when my colleagues take the kind of example I just gave of taking a magnet, touching it to your skull, and having your consciousness change, and they think, okay, that means that the brain caused the consciousness to change. That's the same mistake as saying the virtual reality steering wheel really has causal powers and really is doing the work. It's the same. It's by the way, it's not a trivial mistake, right? It's a very natural mistake because, especially if you are a physicalist, you think that the steering wheel is the final reality. There's nothing else to have causal powers. But is that sort of along the lines of what you're saying with vertical and horizontal?
Kind of. Also because, in spiritual philosophy, one would say that it's not possible to separate the observation from the individual observing it because it's the same thing. So one would actually say that it's the observer that is the author of reality. So nothing is really being observed, it's being projected. So that the observation in itself is false because it is the product of the horizontal consciousness in action. So basically, everything we experience is the result of the projection of what one will refer to as resistance or karma, which basically is the filtering process where you reject everything in oneness or complete reality. And this is what you're left with. And what comes into reality is then the mathematical conclusion, in a way, of your own resistance. And that means that, the idea is that we exist in a kind of blank nothingness. That is also the allness. And based on that, based on our consciousness, based on our own level of evolution in consciousness, our degree of resistance will be what causes the illusion of manifestation. And one then also says that nothing that is manifested actually exists outside the observation of it. So the idea that something exists by itself, like when you close your eyes and when you go out of the room, like we make the assumption, of course, that manifestations are still there. But based on spiritual ideas, it's still, no, it can only exist for as long as someone is observing it. And then the natural conclusion would be that there are higher levels of consciousness and mind, collective minds, that are kind of projecting and thinking together that is part of keeping manifestations alive, so to speak. But it's still part of then collective projections, which is what one in spiritual traditions will look upon as the different universes or multiverses or levels of existence, which then is horizontal and is simply representing the different levels of consciousness and how it filters the oneness into collective experience.
Right. That makes sense. But let me say it in another way to see if I've understood it. So going back to the VR kind of analogy, absolutely everything that you see with the VR headset on is your creation, right? If I see a red Ferrari that I'm racing, um, I look over there, I see the red Ferrari. That's because I'm, in some sense, creating the red Ferrari. Now, if I turn my headset over there, I see a green Mustang. I have deleted, I've quit making the red Ferrari. I don't make that anymore. It's gone. Now I'm making a
Yeah.
green Mustang. And so as I move my headset around, I'm rendering and creating different things, but they only exist in my perceptions. And so, so the nice thing is that young people today who are spending a lot of time in multiplayer video games and virtual reality kinds of settings, this kind of idea is easily grasped
Yeah.
for them. I mean, the idea that, and as VR gets more and more compelling,
Exactly.
I think it won't be very hard for a 15-year-old kid to spend several days in highly compelling virtual reality settings to take off the headset and just naturally wonder, well, what about this?
Exactly.
Could this be a VR as well? So VR may actually end up helping people to sort of break out of
I've
this.
been talking about this for years and years now, that video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today, because
Right.
it assists the mind in being less invested in one template of reality and asking those questions. What's beyond this? Is this all made up? And younger people, yes, they are more open to the idea that there are many different ways of constructing reality. And so I think the whole thing with virtual reality and video games are so important, and it has opened the collective mind as well, because I think to be able to go beyond the collective template of reality, we need first to imagine that it's possible. And it's definitely kind of
Right.
loosened everything up.
Right, and that what you said comes to another thing that you said earlier, which is that there's some kind of cooperation between different consciousnesses in the way that, as you said, they were manifesting. But you could put that in this other language of saying that in some sense, when we have these multiplayer
Yeah.
VR games, they're cooperating. I mean, I might be playing with somebody who I'm in California right now. Maybe I'm playing with someone who is in Europe and someone else who's in China, and we're all racing together, and we're all coordinating. We're all creating. So there's a deeper reality, the supercomputer
Yeah.
that's in this metaphor is coordinating things, but we're all cooperating because we're all with our headsets sort of fabricating the same virtual reality. And so we can all talk about the red Ferrari, even though there's only the red Ferrari I make, the one that you make, and my friend in China makes, and
Yes.
so forth. And there's no such thing as the red Ferrari. And nevertheless, we can have the useful fiction of an objective red Ferrari that's out there that we're all talking about. And maybe I'm trying to beat that red Ferrari, even though my friend is
Right.
racing it. So so there is that kind of cooperation, and I think that ultimately in the science of consciousness will be is an interesting
Yeah.
mathematical issue, which is how do different consciousnesses cooperate? What kind of dynamics allows them to cooperate in a way that they create new coherent
Mm.
virtual realities? Right. So humans, for example, we seem to have a roughly similar shared virtual reality, but it's very different from the reality that, say, a mouse might
Exactly.
have or an ant.
Yes.
So they have
Actually,
different shared
all of
realities.
that. This is part of what I'm teaching people, including scientists. I could explain all this to you if we had several days, because it's very
Right, right.
complex. But once you get it, it's actually quite simple. So, if I could just like try to explain a little bit of the model one is using in the deeper
Sure,
spiritual traditions, it's
sure.
basically that if you take as a premise that there is one absolute reality, that is that state of oneness, that is the closer you can get to that is the absolute mathematics of isness. So it's beyond any form of existence. And often that's referred to as the sea, the ocean of nothingness or allness. And the thing is, then we have to look at what dimensionality is and how it occurs. And basically back to the idea of resistance. If you can think of consciousness also being like a particle, and the heavier the resistance, the slower it kind of vibrates. And any form of resistance, which is basically just another word for karma, and karma is extremely complex. It can consist of like billions of like different variations and vibrations, but each of those vibrations will also be translated into mathematical coordinates. And those coordinates is actually what gives the appearance of dimensionality, just like the virtual reality game. So when you vibrate to the same level of resistance, the illusion of space appears because you will be in that same kind of type of experience, that same level of consciousness. And because when you have several individuals vibrating in the kind of the same area, that will make a certain dimension seem real. But it's simply the collective experience of one's own consciousness. And so one appears to be in the same space, while in reality, there is no such thing as a space. And so one will end up with this infinite universe, infinite multiverse of opportunities and possibilities. And it's simply based on all the different types of vibration that you as consciousness is kind of vibrating at any given moment. And like when you, for instance, look at the example of a mouse and a human being, to a mouse or to an insect or a flower, you are an interdimensional being because you have access to levels of reality that, for instance, a flower does not. So you, to that flower, that exists in a more limited dimension of experience, you are an interdimensional being. And that flower can experience you based on the awareness of that flower, but is not able to go beyond that and will experience whatever that is you that kind of fits within that kind of octave. And the rest of you is in another dimension for that flower. So in spirituality, one sees dimension as extremely complex. It's not a place. It's the experience of kind of co-vibrational reality.
So there could be various shared realities for different systems of consciousnesses.
Exactly. Yes, and whenever there is a kind of shared vibration, that will immediately become a dimension. Because it's just basically also when we meet someone and we kind of click with them, we can experience that as a kind of bubble. We can experience that connection, and all of a sudden we feel kind of transported out of the kind of collective space around us. And we, in fact, become a separate dimension. And often when that happens, our sense of time and space also changes. And it's because that change in dimension, although it's slight, is actually real. So from a spiritual perspective, one sees dimension as part of the expression of consciousness and the level of resistance and the complexity of resistance. And this is what one is trying also to figure out in spiritual traditions, and the deep spiritual work is, how can we go beyond this? How can we neutralize our resistance so that we're able to experience more of that expanded awareness? And then we go into the understanding that consciousness already is. So everything is awareness to start with. So it's not like that individual actually expands the awareness. It's the opposite. It's what we call the defractalization. It's basically the expansion means that the level above, the more expanded version that already is, gets access to that limited form because it's less limited. So it basically means as an individual, when you expand, the self, the identity gets watered out. And this is typical for spiritual practices over time, that people can experience a deep level of clarity and connectedness and a real expansion, but there is less me. There is less self,
Right.
because the self is in a way a construct and also limited to the form in the incarnation. So it's more that the consciousness that already is starts to flow in. And that is the expansion. So one becomes less oneself and more the universe. And for each kind of level of expansion, there is less self and more reality. And this is also the kind of general model behind enlightenment, is one gets to the point where one has been able to fully be absorbed in the absolute reality. It's not the individual. I say, like, the individual never gets enlightened. It's the enlightenment that becomes the individual, because it always starts at the other end. And this is also what I think, like, you're onto something here, by establishing consciousness as the premise.
Right. So in that's very interesting ideas. In the fundamental unity of consciousness, you say that there is this notion of resistance that's leading to these projections that we're so what is the a question that scientists will have is, we're looking for big deep principles. And so the issue is, what is a big deep principle that would explain why should the fundamental consciousness have this issue? Why isn't it just fat, dumb, and happy all by itself? Why does it go through this resistance? So is there some
Yes, and
reason why
it's also very simple to explain. Now, if you take for granted that reality is infinite, and it has to be, and the mathematics is infinite, it means that the possibilities are infinite, which means that one will never get to the point where everything is ever being experienced. Everything cannot be understood. There will always be more. So it's like, in a way, an organism, because whenever there is a variation, that changes everything, because that's math. So it means that consciousness, whenever there is any slight change, is like the whole organism will have to react to it. And basically then everything will have to be relearned. It's like it changes everything. It's basically, if you add anything to a formula, it changes it. So it means everything has to then be reinterpreted, relearned, and all the principles in math changes. So it never stops. So basically, the resistance is the distance. Whenever something changes and there is an established way, an established consciousness, an established awareness, an understanding that now contradicts this change, that will have to be updated. And that's really the resistance. So if you move this into time space, the way I often describe this, if we use the model of souls or Atma, which one can see as particles, is basically drops of water in the ocean. And one can say that each drop will have to go through this full journey because it represents potential that has not been fully realized. So in spiritual traditions, how one explains this is like, if we think of it as a timeline, the starting point is that Atma or soul is already perfect, but has no awareness of it. Because in the isness, it's not possible to experience. Because it's beyond space-time, so there can be no experience. No observation. And therefore, it's just a living potential. So it's only, and that is the maximum amount of resistance. So it's for that potential that is the Atma or the seed to go through the entire evolution until it has fulfilled the full potentials and have become the ocean. So it's basically the completeness of the ocean being fully experienced from every possible angle. And this is why when that happens, everything changes and you have to start again. So it's like it's this enormous mathematical expression that never stops. And again, every slight change will cause more resistance. And one will have to kind of balance it out and figure out what is this. So karma is that resistance. And I like the word resistance because resistance is also a more kind of scientific way of explaining it, because it's not that you don't want to relate to reality, but you can't because you've never experienced it. You have no idea what it is. And it's only through interaction, it's only by expanding awareness that you have access to it. So it's basically getting to the point where you completely mirror the ocean. And that is, in spiritual traditions, this is how one describes that full journey. But it never stops because it can't. Logically, one can conclude that if reality is math and it's infinite, even the totality is never done.
Well, I really like this direction of thought. It seems very promising to me. It's interesting. I've been thinking in a similar direction, based on something called Girdles' incompleteness theorem. And this is a result in mathematics by a logician named Kurt Gödel, who was actually ended up being a friend of Einstein's. They hung out together for quite a while. And what Gödel proved was, without going into the technical details, that there is no end to the exploration of mathematical structure in principle, that no matter how much mathematical structure is explored, in effect, you've only begun. And the key to his theorem was a notion of self-reference, a system or a mathematical expression referring to itself. And it's in this notion of self-reference that you got this incompleteness result. And so the direction I've been thinking, it sounds very, very similar to yours, and see if you agree that they're on the same track or not. The idea would be that if there's only consciousness, if that's all that exists, then mathematical structure can only be about one thing, which is conscious experiences or consciousness itself. And that therefore what Gödel is telling us is that the inexhaustible profundity and the fact that mathematics is never ending, the exploration of mathematical structure is never ending, means that there's no end to the possibilities of the varieties of conscious experience. I call this Gödel's candy store. So Gödel's candy store is this infinite variety of possible structures and kinds of consciousness. And since in principle, it's inexhaustible, the exploration can never stop in principle. That would then be, I think from a scientist's point of view, a deep enough principle. Now, I'm not saying it's right, but at least it's a deep enough to be a candidate principle for what consciousness would be up to and why there would be some dynamics at all. Because a natural question would be, the one I mentioned earlier, which is, why should consciousness be doing anything? Why shouldn't it just sit there, right? So we have to have some deep principle that would be compelling enough to say, oh yeah, that's a deep enough principle to say why consciousness needs to have a dynamic. It's not just sitting there self-satisfied forever.
Right. Yes. Yes, this is absolutely what I'm saying. One thing that is really interesting, though, is in spiritual tradition, one would say that there is something beyond consciousness, because consciousness will always be limited. So it's part of, if we can refer to Atma or soul as a mathematical principle, I sometimes refer to it as a source code. And consciousness is the result of the resistance. And that creates the awareness of isness based on the limitations of resistance, because that's how much of the ocean you can deal with. So the thing is that at some point you go beyond consciousness, because consciousness ultimately cannot exist without kind of time space in some form. There are like versions of that, laws of nature that are far kind of beyond this type of dimension. But consciousness is also linked to a certain limitation. And in the ocean itself, there is no such thing. So consciousness can only exist as part of the journey. And it defines the levels of, I'm going to say, evolution that soul go through. It defines everything. It defines the space. It defines laws of nature. It defines, the premise of experience and all of that. And the point of that is to, of course, expand awareness even more, because that becomes the space one is able to deal with. And that is why also in spiritual tradition that one always is trying to push expansion of awareness. Now, one thing one also talks about, which to me also is the mathematics of existence, is because everything is constantly changing. If you stand still, life will still change you because you are part of it. So you can't stand still, because if it's one big organic chain reaction that never stops, there is no such thing as standing still. So consciousness cannot stand still. It is impossible. Everything it relates to will continuously change based on this. It's this never-ending explosion of exploration. So even if we try sitting there, existence will unfold us. So no one has a choice, and it's not something we actively do. It's just mathematics and expression, and it never stops. So it's not, the individual component in, oh, should I do this or that, is from this point of view completely uninteresting, and it's not real. It is that complete expression that we're all a part of that kind of drives that whole unfoldment also of individual consciousness.
So if I understand right, you're saying that beyond conscious experiences, there's something that transcends any experience at all.
And that and that is true enlightenment.
And that is in some sense the ultimate nature of reality then. But that deep non-experiential fundamental reality gives rise to specific experiential expressions, and somehow that's due to a resistance. Now, is that resistance within this fundamental non-conscious reality?
It's as I say, it's the drop, not understanding that it's the ocean.
So from this point of view, why does the fundamental existence need to dabble in conscious experiences at all then? Why should it make drops that are unenlightened? Why shouldn't it just sit there? But what is the fundamental principle that says that a scientist might go say, okay, I can understand why this reality that transcends any experience must logically make these drops that are resistant and unenlightened, and why shouldn't it just be self-sufficient and happy? But beyond experience of happy, just self-sufficient and just
because also the ocean is the result of its kind of conscious agents. So it's kind of that completeness of it. And just like it's very difficult to explain this because it goes so far beyond the human mind that one has to try to find ideas that somewhat is able to point in the right direction. But it's basically just like looking at life When you look at this planet and when you look at evolution, evolution does not happen because a life form says, well, we're not happy, we want to change. It's not how it works. It's simply a result of a chain reaction that never ends, because everybody affects everyone and it never stops. So once there is movement, everything moves and it never ever stops. So it's basically it's not possible to exist, anything to exist, without that movement. Because experience is actually registering change. When there is absolute stillness, there is nothing. So experience is observing change. And that's all. So everything is based on this continuous expression. And basically, why does this ocean need it? It doesn't need it. It's not what it's about. It's down to the math and understanding how it's infinite, and therefore how it must always change. So there is no motivation behind it. It's simply how it is.
Well, and that's a good point in the sense that in scientific explanations, we always do come to a stop where we just have to say that's how it is, right?
Yeah.
There's every scientific explanation starts with what we call our assumptions, but they are the miracles of the theory, and that's where explanation stops. And that's just fundamental to the nature of explanation, that you can never have a theory of everything. You always have to have a theory of everything given these miracles, these assumptions. And that is a stunning fact about the nature of explanation, right? That you have a kid and you tell them something, they say, why is the sky blue? And you give them some answer. You say, but why is that? And why is that? And they keep, and finally you just throw up your hands and say, it's just true, right? And the same thing happens in scientific explanations, that at some point we just throw up our hands and say there's this fundamental fact. Of course, we then look for a deeper explanation in which what we took as a fundamental fact is now being explained by something deeper, but then we always have that deeper miracle. And so there's going to be that never-ending, in some sense. Here again, we see a never-ending process, right, of explanation. That the very fact that there's no final starting point is perhaps another reflection of what we're talking about here. If we're thinking about what consciousness or the ocean, as you say, behind consciousness, if what it's up to is understanding, if that were the thing, self-understanding, then that would again lead to this infinite regress of activity. So that seems. I mean, we're on the same page there.